Okay. Uh-oh.
How's that?
How is it?
Sounds good.
Okay. Let's get this back on full screen. Let me hide this. All right. All right. Perfect. And do we want to put the camera on as well? Oh, yes, we can do that. Now I have to do that again. All right. Oh, I can do that again. Okay. Oops. There we go.
All right. Awesome. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Kat White. I'm the Director of Collections at the Stowe Center. If someone online who's watching on Zoom can just pop in a chat that you can hear me, that everything seems to be okay, I will appreciate that. Yes, so I am Kat White, Director of Collections at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, where we encourage social justice and literary activism by exploring the life and legacy of Harriet Beecher Stowe and everyone who advocates hope and freedom then and now. Each year, we award the Stowe Prize for Literary Activism to a book that embodies and inspires the values of advocating for justice, equity, and a society which welcomes everyone. Our 2024 Stowe Prize winner was Dr. Bettina Love for her book, Punished for Dreaming, which exposed the racism and harm inherent to many of the policies that inform our education system and laid out a plan to work towards education justice. We recognize that this issue, education and justice and equity, is incredibly relevant to Hartford and impacts all learners as well as their families and communities. And so we are diving deeper into this topic of education justice with the Stowe Prize series of programs. This is our second program in this series, and we'll delve into a topic which, as many issues related to inclusion, health, and justice, feels very urgent at this time. So I am very pleased to introduce Kim Adamski. Kim is an experienced sexual health educator. She focuses on LGBTQ+, inclusive, comprehensive, and pleasure-based sexual health education, and has worked with a variety of audiences from college students to prison inmates. Additionally, Kim writes on the topic of sexual health and is a regular contributor to CT Voice magazine and Black Noise magazine. So welcome, Kim. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Kat. All right, hello, friends. Thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna sit in this tall seat because I'm recovering from foot surgery. Don't worry, my foot's great. I'm great, but just gonna sit down. Like Kat said, I'm Kim Adamski. I am a community health worker, sex educator. I've been working in sex ed for almost 15 years now. And I'm also kind of what you might call a sex nerd. I love talking about history and social aspects of sexuality, as well as just telling everyone to use condoms. Well, do that. I have an educational background in healthcare, sexuality studies, and public health. And I also, I've done HIV testing and STI testing. And like I said, huge nerd about sex ed. You will always catch me reading a book. My husband will corroborate this. So what is sex ed? In order to be considered adequate by the World Health Organization, sex education should be comprehensive, which means it covers a wide range of topics that enable people to live healthy sexual lives. Age appropriate, so lessons should be tailored to the needs and level of understanding of who is being taught. So for example, young children are going to get somewhat less complicated information than somebody who is, say, 16 years old. And it also should be scientifically accurate based on the most recent evidence that we have. And as we know, scientific evidence is always changing. And so it's really important as sex educators to keep up with the current evidence, and not to be bogged down by myths, falsehoods, or what sometimes people say is common sense, because it doesn't always go along with what studies will say. So actually, first I want to ask, who here received sex ed in school as youth? Raise your hand. So most of you. Who here received sex ed that you felt was comprehensive and timely? All right, we got a few hands. Who here learned about sex ed topics that relate to LGBTQ folks? We have a few iffy ones. What about sex ed that talked about pleasure and enjoyment? No. What did we all learn about? How not to get STIs, right? You will get pregnant and die, etc. Yeah, no, that's I mean, that's important. Well, you will not get pregnant and die, but it is important information to know how to not do that if you don't want to, but that's not the only thing we want to talk about. So sex ed in the United States has kind of gone up and down. We like to think of ourselves as always progressing, but it's more of a wavy sort of thing. Like, for example, we're getting more sex ed now than we did in the 1800s, but we're actually getting less sex ed than we did in the 70s, for example. So interesting there. So in early America in the 1800s, sex was rooted in very strict, idealized gender roles, and we're probably all familiar generally with gender roles. Somebody tell me what gender role is. Anyone? Yes.
It's when your gender dictates the way you're supposed to act.
Yes, exactly. When the gender that you have, usually your sex assigned at birth in this particular case, dictates or says how you should act as a person. For anyone who isn't aware, sex assigned at birth is if a baby's born and has a penis, they say this is a boy. If a baby's born and has vagina, they say this is a girl. Whereas gender is your personal identity and how you feel in your brain. So at the time in the 1800s, sexual wellness was not really considered a health issue. It was a moral issue. And that's interesting because by then we absolutely knew that STIs, for example, were spread through sexual contact, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody actually cared about that who was teaching. So way back, way before this, at the beginning of Christianity, as the church was gaining power, just for background, sexual health was made a moral issue because it was the easiest way to tell an uneducated population, this is what you should do. It was much easier to explain God will send you to hell than, okay, so there's this like disease and it's spread this way and you can prevent it this way. And that ended up just becoming dogma in the church, and that has followed us until now. And it is largely the church, but not 100% the church that was telling us this. At this time, women were not considered sexual beings. They kind of provided the service of sex to men. It was part of their job in giant quotes as a wife to be of sexual service to a man and also to bear children. People who were not married, well, women who were not married, were assumed to be abstinent. So they didn't need sex ed, right? They weren't having sex, right? No way. And in addition to this, masturbation was considered to be morally corrupt. I mean, I'm sure some of you have heard myths about masturbation, and I think I have a little more about that in a bit, but that was also not allowed. No sex stuff.
You'll go blind.
Yeah, you'll go blind, exactly. And sex education was primarily given via written materials because nobody wanted to talk about it. So it had to be like covertly passed around. I mean, some of you, maybe your parents left like a sex ed book in your room, hopefully one that was actually helpful, unlike any of these. But, you know, that was kind of how it was done. So we've got some examples. They were kind of coded in a way not to be like, this book is about sex. Yeah. So we have Talk Upon Practical Subjects by Marion Harland, 1895. And The Woman's Medical Companion by Frederick J. Garbett. And a lot of these were just general health guides that touched on sex, mostly in regards to procreation. Some of them wouldn't even say like how the sex is done. They just be like, and then you will do the thing and a baby will happen. So not necessarily helpful information, and kind of a weird, maybe nasty surprise right after you get married. Like, oh, okay, well, that's something I am learning as I do it. So yeah, those are some fun ones. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some sorry, some Connecticut history. Sylvester Graham. He invented graham crackers. Does anyone know why he invented graham crackers? Don't look at the slide.
Sexual desire.
Exactly. So Sylvester Graham, he kind of invented the vegetarian diet in the the States. And he was born in West Suffield, Connecticut in 1794. So yay, Suffield, I guess. But he decided that everybody should eat vegetarian diets because it made them less horny. He believed that overstimulation was the cause of mental illness and physical illness. The body getting too stimulated would inflame the brain and nervous system, thus leading to insanity. So he felt that, eating less meat was less stimulating, eating bland foods was less stimulating. And what is the most stimulating activity of all? Having sex. That is absolutely not something we want to be doing, because we will inflame our brain and go mad. Of course, if we want to continue the species, we have to. So he's like, all right, you can do that, but don't get too crazy with it. All right. Like, don't take all your clothes off if you can avoid it, because that'll just make you go, you'll go too hard. So anyway, he did invent graham crackers as part of a preventive diet. They were not as yummy as they are now. He probably would not condone marshmallows and chocolate as an addition. But we do still have them today, and we are probably perverting their purpose with s'mores, and I approve. So yeah, our friend Sylvester, don't have sex, you will get inflamed and die. All right, so then we have the Comstock Act. Anthony Comstock was born in Connecticut also. I don't know why Connecticut is just producing all of these people. Thanks for that. But he was on a crusade to eradicate obscenity in the United States. He felt that birth control was obscene, knowledge about conception and sexuality was obscene. He felt that the distribution of condoms was obscene. He probably had some childhood trauma, I don't know. But he successfully lobbied to make birth control illegal, even for married couples in their own home. To be fair, this was not very enforced, because what are the cops going to come and like spy on you constantly to make sure you're not like pulling out or something? I don't know. But he did make it illegal. He made distributing information about birth control illegal, and he got into a whole tiff with oh my God, why is her name escaping me? The founder of Planned Parenthood.
Yes, I was thinking that too. What is her name?
Sanger.
Yes,
Yeah.
Margaret Sanger. Thank you. Oh my gosh, I don't know how I forgot that. Yeah, so he got into a whole tiff with her. There was a whole legal case, and she was arrested and she sued, and married couples did end up with the right to use birth control. But yeah, so Comstock kind of had a huge effect, especially in New York, because that was where he had the lobbied for the laws to be passed, but they affected their neighboring states. As we know, even today, Connecticut, as soon as New York does something, we have to copy them. So that was also the case then, but we were copying them in a negative way, in my opinion. Connecticut actually was the most restrictive state in the country when it comes to sex ed, birth control, that sort of thing. So we consider ourselves pretty progressive now, and for the United States, we definitely are, but it was not always the case. So what do I have here? All right. So in the early 20th century, things got a little bit more progressive. We moved towards more science-based information. Morality still, of course, influenced this a lot, but we were kind of starting to think of science as more important for the general population. Sex ed focused a lot on reproduction. A lot of sex ed videos, for example, and I'm sure you all know that sex ed is often taught by video rather than by actual human being. A lot of them focused on like fertilization and like the menstrual period and that sort of thing. And typically still did not say how the sperm met the egg. You would ask, hey, but how does the sperm get there? And the adults would start mumbling like, I don't know, I don't, just figure it out. So we did have a little bit more sex ed, but maintenance in marriage still kind of fell a lot on women. The wife was responsible again for providing sex to the husband, for making sure that everything in the house was done, for taking care of children, for bearing him children. We weren't really talking about LGBTQ folks at all at this point. So we were only talking about a man and a woman in a heterosexual relationship. And a lot of sex ed also focused on teaching women how to attract a man. So it would be about being attractive, being polite and demure, and being kind, and all the things that were stereotypically female gender roles at the time. So there wasn't as much focus on men attracting women at that time, because presumably the men were out making the money. So the woman had to be like, hey, can you support me? Because I'm not allowed to work. So that's kind of how that went. But at this time also, moms began teaching their daughters about sexuality. Partly about like what it was, how it was performed, finally, hopefully to avoid surprises after marriage or before marriage, depending on what you were doing. And also sometimes about birth control. This information would be passed down from woman to woman before it was readily available to the general public. So at the time, access to condoms was a little iffier than it is now. I mean, you can just go to Planned Parenthood and grab a handful now. But at the time, not as available. So methods generally included like figuring out your menstrual cycle or withdrawal, pulling out, stuff like that. But it was still, knowledge was power, and it still helped women to a degree control the size of their family. So things are starting to look up a little bit, right? So here we've got another interesting little book called Perfect Womanhood for Maidens, Wives, and Mothers. And this is another one about like how to act as a woman, how to get a husband, how to please your husband. And then like, stuff like hygiene. We had some interesting hygiene methods too. Who's ever heard of the use of Lysol to clean the female reproductive organs? Yeah, don't do that. Don't. But that was recommended by the company Lysol in their ads with very shamey advertising. People also used Coca-Cola. I'm not making this up. So obviously we did not have very good hygiene education. Of course, it was also a matter of having access to this kind of literature as well, because, if you think it's embarrassing now to go to the library and check out a book about sex, it's not, just do it. It was even more embarrassing in the early 1900s. So, all right. So in 1914, there was a big controversy in the papers. A teacher at a public school decided to talk about how a baby is made. Oh no. Part of what she said is a little seed is sown inside of your mother's body. God opened a door to you and brought you out into the world. Sounds pretty tame, right? God forbid. Is anyone like super offended right now, or? But this was was a really, really big deal in 1914 for a public school teacher to be talking about this. Generally, it was believed that sex ed belonged at home. And so as a result, people were writing into the papers demanding this woman be fired. She did actually write into the paper defending her teaching and saying that it is really important for kids to know about this stuff. But, you know, I mean, even now we're still hearing uproar about teaching sex ed in schools. Sex ed is a little bit less metaphorical now, hopefully, although I don't know if you've all heard some of the wild stuff that they talk about in abstinence only education. But all right. Okay, so let's talk more about Margaret Sanger because I love her. Disclaimer, it is worth noting that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Who knows what eugenics is? Yes, who wants to tell me? I mean, I know, I'm just hoping somebody will also know.
Yes, it's population control either by restricting populations of certain people or encouraging populations of other people.
Yes, exactly.
World War II, right?
Yeah, so it did lead to that. So eugenics originally was the idea that we should be encouraging people who are more desirable, i.e. white, cisgender, able-bodied, etc., to reproduce, because the less desirable, giant air quotes, people were reproducing too much and would ruin the country. At the time, this was considered like very cutting edge science. So it is worth noting that this was like in progressive circles. And it's also worth noting that right now, probably some things that we're all really pumped about are going to turn out to be like not so great. So it is important to keep historical context, but also it's important to note that that is what led to like Nazi Germany and extermination of Jews. So not saying that's great. It's pretty bad. But Margaret Sanger also was a huge advocate for birth control. She wrote a pamphlet called What Every Woman Should Know about birth control methods, how to get them. She distributed birth control, and eventually she opened a family planning clinic in New York at, as you can see, 46 Amboy Street. Its goal was actually to prevent abortion and infanticide, as well as preventing poverty and helping people, you know, live the lives they want to. Unfortunately, Andrew Comstock, who we talked about before, did not like this, not a fan. And he called the police, and the police came and arrested Margaret and her sister. And a long legal battle then occurred. Luckily, it worked out because Andrew Comstock was thrown out and birth control information was permitted to be distributed under certain circumstances. And now we have Planned Parenthood all around the country. Probably many of us have been to a Planned Parenthood, and if not, probably know someone who has at least. It's one of the biggest providers of birth control and abortion services in the country. And yeah. So that's Margaret. There's actually a really good graphic novel about her called, I believe it was called Rebel Woman. It's very cute and very easy to read. So take a look at that. Okay, so now let's move into mid-century America. So post-war, we're kind of having more of a resurgence of talking about critical thinking and science and making informed decisions. And obviously this was not unilaterally across the board, because we all probably associate strict gender roles with the 1950s, right? And that was oftentimes the case, especially for wealthy folks. When it came to poorer folks, they often had to focus on more practical matters, like controlling the sizes of their family to what they could afford and felt comfortable with. But scientifically, we had lots of advances in sexuality. For example, Alfred Kinsey, his studies on sexuality were published in that time period. And Alfred Kinsey came up with the Kinsey scale. Does anyone know what that is? All right, anyone want to tell me? What's the Kinsey scale?
It was like the first scale that measured human bisexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So it's a very early measure of bisexuality that starts at a 0, which is completely heterosexual, and ends in a 5, which is completely homosexual, and anything in between is some degree of bisexual. And he did find that the majority of people are some degree of bisexual. And bisexual people exist. Oh my God. But we also had Masters and Johnson mapping the human arousal system. So they figured out how people assigned male at birth versus female at birth experience arousal and how their bodies react in different scenarios. That was very controversial at the time, but now a lot of our sexuality studies are based on that. The goal in mid-century sex education was to help students make informed decisions, which is also my goal, to help people make informed decisions. A lot of it was still based on Christian morals, though. So, for example, they'd be like, this is how you protect yourself during sex, but also you shouldn't have sex outside of marriage. Now, that is a belief many people have, but trying to instill your own beliefs in scientific sex education is really not best practice. But we are starting to kind of get there. Once we got into the 1950s and 60s, they started a more morally neutral approach. I actually recently watched a movie called The Story of Sex Ed, which my friend here found for me at the library and gave to me. It was very good. And one of the things I thought was most impressive was a mid-century sex ed video that talked about masturbation in a morally neutral way. The scene was a coach talking to his team about sexual health, and it was a boys' like baseball team or something. And one of them asked about masturbation. And he was like, yeah, masturbation is when you have like sexual activity with yourself, and also that it's not bad for you, it's fine, and that it's just you have to do it in privacy, essentially, which was very progressive for the time. We would not really think of the mid-century as having that kind of sex ed, but it was available, if not widespread. We also famously saw that the Disney has a pretty famous sex ed movie for girls in particular called The Story of Menstruation. And it's very cutesy. It has some fairly accurate information. It's done in a way that's a little bit overly cutesy, I guess, instead of like super factual. But it wasn't terrible, especially for the mid-century. So yeah, that's what we've got going in like the 40s through 60s. And as we approached the 60s, we started getting a lot more progressive with this. Incidentally, that coincided with the mass availability of the birth control pill. So here's some more little historical bits. So here we start having more scientific information available in books as well. So we have sex, hygiene, and venereal disease, which is what we used to call STIs. But also we had some very questionable things in them as well. For example, don't forget that any woman who lets you use her or who consents easily is not safe. So we still kind of see those messages today, though, do we not?
Yeah.
Like, has anyone ever been through an abstinence only program? No, you're all lucky. I have not either, luckily. My school did not provide sex ed, but it didn't provide abstinence only sex ed. So I guess that's kind of the positive flip side there. But yeah, so there was a lot of misconceptions and moral judgments, but at the same time, the point it was trying to get to is to think about sexual activity before you engage in it, which is a valid thing. So we have this other one, Mother and Daughter from the 40s, which was an intellectual and frank discussion of the subjects of social hygiene, physiology, the science of sex, moral living, character building, motherhood, and prenatal care. A very nice long intro. And that was a lot more comprehensive than a lot of the stuff we used to see. Actually, I have an example of I guess not my personal belonging, but I recently went to visit a cousin, and my mom gave me a book to bring to her, and it was her dad's baby book. And not only did it have information about like that you could write in about like how long he is and how heavy he is and, you know, his little lock of hair or whatever, but it also had a lot about pregnancy and childbirth and, you know, that sort of thing. And some of it was accurate, but a lot of it was very like, the pregnant mother is very fragile and shouldn't be doing anything. You shouldn't be exercising. Once you start to show, you should quit work. You should not be at work. And I also saw that it said that you should not be having sex in the 3rd trimester because it is too vigorous. So that was an interesting one. So I gave it to my cousin and was like, this is a fun historical module, but don't heed the advice necessarily. Luckily, she's very smart and knows not to do that. Okay, so then we also have some more progressive ones. For example, sooner or later, your children are going to learn about sex. They ought to, they must, which is absolutely true because the vast majority of us do go on to have sex at some point. And I mean, even now, we don't tell kids about sex, and then we expect them to go on and have healthy sexual lives as adults. How are they supposed to do that? That would be like giving somebody a car without teaching them how to drive. Very dangerous. So, I mean, sex ed geared towards younger kids also started to become a thing. We have Sex in Our Schools, a complete analysis of young people's sexual problems and mores from kindergarten to college, and a comprehensive case history study of the new rebellion. So I question the choice of the word rebellion, but also the acknowledgement that youth should have sex ed from kindergarten to college is very progressive at that time. I mean, sex ed, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most big authorities on the subject, is that even very young children can have some degree of sex ed and that it's helpful, like basic consent, ask before holding somebody's hand, how a baby is made, especially, you know, if mom is pregnant, they're gonna be like, where'd that come from? Did you eat a watermelon? No. So it is a really good acknowledgement here that young kids should receive very basic sex ed concepts. All right, so it's also important to note the role of race, though. So race, in addition to gender, which we've talked about a lot, race has also had an impact on sex education. Even now, but particularly even more so in history, people of color, Black folks in particular, have been perceived as hypersexual and even dangerous, like the idea that Black men were running around raping white women, not at any more rate than any other group in the population, truthfully, but people were very afraid that this was happening. And I mean, we see this today in the idea that immigrants from South America and Mexico and Central America are running around raping and murdering people. Again, that is not happening any more among them than among any other racial group. But this heavily influences the sexual attitudes that we display towards people of color and about people of color, and also whether or not we provide them with comprehensive sex ed. In city schools, like in Hartford, for example, we have very high pregnancy rates, and that is in part due to a lack of adequate sex education. The sex education that they do receive is oftentimes fear tactics. Now, the reason that that is so prevalent, fear tactics, I mean, is because when we see something happening that seems really bad, like for example, high rates of STIs among teens, it scares us. So we're like, all right, well, if it's scaring us, maybe we should scare them, and then they will not do it. That doesn't work. On the other hand, providing comprehensive sex ed to kids does lead to more condom use, less teen pregnancy, and also delayed first time having sex. So people who receive comprehensive sex ed have the first time having sex later in their life. The other unfortunate experience that a lot of people of color have is coercive birth control practices. This is especially evident in the case of long-acting reversible contraceptives. That includes IUDs and the implant. Women of color have routinely said that the doctors will not remove their birth control implant unless they say what birth control they're going to use from there on out. In other cases, I mean, luckily, that's probably not like the majority of doctors, but it is enough that it's been reported on. Other times, just shaming women of color for not using birth control or for however many kids they have. As much as we all may have opinions on what the proper number of kids to have or something like that is, ultimately people have their own bodily autonomy, and it is not our place to judge them. It is our place to provide the information that is accurate to do with it what they will. People can make their own decisions. Whether or not we agree with them is beside the point. In addition, there are worse sexual health outcomes. Some of you may know that the United States has one of the highest maternal death rates in the Western world. It's even higher for women of color. And that's in part because they won't necessarily seek medical help because of the way that they have been treated in the past. So this applies to all kinds of healthcare, but also sexual health. And thus, poor sexual health outcomes are more common amongst communities of color. Okay, so another little Connecticut thing, Griswold versus Connecticut. So this lawsuit made birth control legal for married couples in the United States. It took place right in our very own state. So when birth, oh no, did I not? I don't know. It was in like the 50s. I don't know. I had this slide. Yeah, this slide is not formatted correctly, and I'm sorry. So ignore the graph. It doesn't mean anything. But yeah, in the 50s, Griswold versus Connecticut legalized birth control for married couples. Prior to this, it was not legal for anybody. People were not allowed to access the birth control pill in the United States, even though it was very effective. And yes, 1965, thank you, not the 50s. Wow, that's unfortunately later than I thought it was. Thank you for looking that up. Yeah, so prior to this, married couples were not permitted to use birth control, let alone single women. Whew, no way. But prior to that, it was not available. It is very safe though. It's even safer now than it was at the time. And they used this, like they used the concept of privacy and also provider-patient confidentiality to determine that birth control was a matter of private rights and of a decision between a doctor and the patient. This reasoning is actually what we ended up using in the future when we passed Roe v. Wade, which since is no longer in place, unfortunately. But it was a very big deal at the time to enshrine provider-patient confidentiality in law in this way, because this was also long before HIPAA. All right, so let's talk about some current statistics. So it's not looking good. In 2023, there was an 800% increase in sex ed restrictive bills introduced. Many states actually forbid LGBTQ inclusive sex ed. Not all states require sex ed of any kind. Connecticut is one of them. It's not required in Connecticut. And we've been having anti-sex ed bills in Connecticut as well. For example, there is a bill for libraries right now. You know, probably some of you come from towns where there's been like controversy over what's available in the library, right? I know that this is particularly happening up by like Enfield, Suffield, that area. So there is a bill coming through right now protecting librarians' right to use their expertise to cultivate an age-appropriate and community-appropriate collection of books, as opposed to just having parents come in and be like, this has gay stuff in it, get it out of here. Which the parents are not experts. They have the right to say, hey, kid, you can't read this, but they don't have the right to say, all of you other kids can't read this either. So that's going through our legislature right now. And you can testify about it tomorrow, actually, if you want to go to the LOB and sit around for hours on end. Just saying. Or you could submit a written testimony, which is what I did because I have a doctor's appointment. But also, we're also seeing a lot of anti-inclusion educational bills. So, I mean, in 2025, we've seen a lot of executive orders, not all of which are going to stick, but, you know, are having a big effect. For example, not being permitted to talk about sexuality and gender in certain ways in classrooms, and not being allowed to use people's pronouns that they use correctly. In Connecticut right now, they are actually trying to pass SJ 35, which is an amendment to our state constitution that would be an equal rights amendment. Right now, under Connecticut law, people are protected by an anti-discrimination law that talks about gender and sexuality, but this would actually put it in the Constitution. And this would apply to education. So LGBTQ folks, for example, would not be able to be eliminated from education. Obviously, enforcement is a whole other thing, but having it in law is a good start. So the most recent, or I guess probably not the most recent, there's been so many executive orders, I didn't update this literally today, but there was one called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling. Has anyone read this one? Okay, it's a rough read. You might not want to, honestly, although it's probably good information to have. But basically, it is saying that we cannot talk about gender and sexuality. We cannot talk about sexism or racism. We cannot talk about trans folks in our K-12 schooling. And this would be a disservice in many ways, obviously. I mean, it states like literally that we cannot talk about the founding documents of the United States being sexist when they categorically excuse women, by definition, making them sexist. But it also would require schools to not talk about LGBTQ related sex ed topics, and not talk about sexuality and sexual orientation and diversity of sexuality, gender, anything like that, no matter the grade, not even like at a lower level or anything like that. So that is if it's upheld. And I know a lot of these probably won't be upheld, but there are some legislators in our state who are trying to limit discussion on gender and sexuality for younger grades, and to make it, quote, age appropriate for older kids. Now, I agree things should be age appropriate, but I also know that age appropriate is often used as a euphemism for these kids are too young to know anything, don't teach them anything. Which is, I mean, I work with youth in my day job, and the kids I work with are very smart. They are capable of understanding things like sex and gender, and also deserve that information. All right, so in Connecticut, our sex ed statistics. Schools, like I said, are not required to teach sex ed in Connecticut. They do have to teach human development and disease prevention. What do you all think that that means?
Puberty.
The stages of a fetus, yeah. I got something in front. Puberty. Mm-hmm.
Vague notions of STDs without reference to sex.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so that sort of thing. I mean, probably most of us watched the movie in school, right? You know, they tell you about periods. Mine was interesting. I remember it was like this girl's at a camp out in her friend's backyard, and she gets her period. So she goes inside and tells the friend's mom, and the mom opens her bathroom cabinet, and it's stocked to the brim with always pads. You could practically hear the rainbow sound. And they also plug secret deodorant too, because they sponsored it as well. So we did learn about periods. I did not learn as much about them as my mom was kind enough to teach me, but I mean, it was something. Not sure what the boys learned, because I was not allowed to learn about penises, apparently. Those are alien, not allowed. Again, luckily I had parents who did teach me the important things, but not everybody does. And then for disease prevention, that's really up to interpretation, because what diseases? I mean, I learned about HIV. I did not learn how to prevent it. There's a funny story in my family where my cousin learned the same thing as me. She learned about HIV. She learned that it was spread through blood. And then she went home and she was like, Mom, what if I get a cut on my finger and another girl on the playground has a cut on her finger, and then our fingers touch and I die of HIV? So that is a very improbable circumstance, especially among children, but I can understand why she'd be worried if we're telling her you get HIV through blood and not actually how to avoid getting HIV. And I also learned, I mean, I don't think I went home crying. My mom would have to corroborate that though. But yeah, so that's not really an adequate education there. I definitely did not learn about chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, anything like that. I definitely never saw a condom put on a banana or a model or whatever. So that was pretty lacking. Connecticut does have official guidelines, though, that provide recommendations for comprehensive sex ed, and they're not actually too bad. I have read them. They are based on federal guidelines from Healthy People 2030, which is like a big government initiative. There are better sex ed standards called the National Sex Ed Standards by Advocates for Youth. It's endorsed by the CDC. They're a lot more comprehensive, have a lot more information. I developed my curricula based on that, but unfortunately that's not every curriculum and not every school curriculum in Connecticut either. In Connecticut, we also have an opt-out policy, which is that parents can choose to remove their children from sex ed instruction should they choose. Obviously, everybody's going to have differing opinions on that. It is very important for kids to know about sex ed, in my opinion. But I mean, again, there is the whole issue of parents' rights, but that is something that Connecticut has. Yeah.
Are Connecticut's official guidelines meant for the benefit of schools or of parents, or just something that is publicly available that people can seek out on their own, but isn't really provided to any person?
Thank you for asking that. So they are meant for the benefit of schools. Schools are meant to use them to base their curricula on. They are available for anybody to use should they choose. They're hidden somewhere on the Connecticut.gov website, and you better get them before the federal government wipes it. Download those. But I do also recommend the Advocates for Youth one. That probably won't be scrubbed because that's not a federal organization. It's a nonprofit. But the other thing is that the vast majority of teachers who provide sex ed do not receive adequate training to provide sex ed. So even if they're well-intentioned and want to provide good sex ed, without the training, they really cannot provide adequate sex education. That's why we have gym teachers teaching sex ed a lot, very uncomfortably. Allegedly at my school, after I graduated, they had all the kids do presentations on a different type of birth control, and then the next year didn't do it because it was inappropriate. So I don't know the logic there. I'm not going to name drop my high school, but you could come to me afterward and I will complain. But yeah, so yeah, it varies, but it is available for schools. So I'm going to make you all a call to action now, because these statistics are kind of abysmal, but you can do something. So first of all, learn as much as you can. If you are a parent, read as many books about teaching your kids sex ed as you can. There's lots of great books. I have tons of recommendations. I have personally read so many. Again, my husband will come downstairs and be like, oh, this book, What Makes a Baby, is just sitting on our table and we don't have a kid. By the way, What Makes a Baby is a very cute one for like ages maybe 5 to 8. Highly recommend it. But yeah, so share that knowledge, share it with your kid. Your kid could go on to give that information and correct another kid that they hear saying something wild. I mean, I heard some wild stuff about what sex was when I was in like 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade that was very incorrect. And a rumor has it that that's what prompted my parents to finally like give me some sex ed. So yeah, so that's one thing you can do, but also learning as much as you can about sex ed for yourself. I mean, none of us know everything. I don't even know everything about sex ed, and learning more and then teaching other people is a really good way to do that. But make sure you're getting it from credible sources. That's getting harder and harder now. I mean, who has like a crazy aunt who posts like weird misinterpretations of a scientific study that they read third hand? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I have, there's some odd things floating around on social media. Get off of that if you can, honestly. But yeah, make sure your source is credible. If you're reading a book, look up the author and see what their credentials are. See what they have written about in the past. See where they've been published. That's all very important. And also try to evaluate what values they're promoting in their book. That's not to say that it's not okay to have values. I mean, each of us has value. Obviously, I value comprehensive sex ed and sexual pleasure and that sort of thing. But it's important to know where your stuff is coming from. If you're reading a study, check who's paying for it. A lot of pharmaceutical companies will pay for studies and then make the data look like it was interpreted in a way that goes in their favor. So try to look at that. Sometimes evidence that isn't paid for by companies won't be available. So that is what we would have to go on at the time. But ideally, we can get information from studies that are not biased. And in addition to that, when you look at news articles, for example, click to the source info, because sometimes you'll go to an article and it'll be like, tofu is giving men giant breasts and then they die. And then you go to the study and that's literally not what the study said at all. So yeah, definitely look at that. Teaching your kids accurate sex ed. Even if they have sex ed in school, ask, what did you learn today? Tell me more. Ask them to think critically about it. Add on to it if necessary. You can also attend school board meetings. Those are open to the public. You can talk to your school board about the importance of providing comprehensive sex ed. You can bring people with you to back you on that. You can provide them resources that might help them understand the importance of this, because remember, they're your employees. You are paying them with your tax money. Same thing with your legislators. Last Friday, I testified at the legislative office building, and my last sentence was, remember, you are the employer of the taxpayers, and it is your job to protect your constituents. Remind them that. I mean, to be fair, you can't, take away their salary, but you can take away your vote. And they really want your vote, especially at the local level. Organize and attend community sex ed programming. Now, obviously I'm biased because I provide community sex ed programming, and I hope to see you all at my next one. But I mean, you can organize that. You can organize discussions about sexuality. You can organize book clubs about sexuality. You can attend sex ed programming like you are today. That's all stuff that you can do for your community. And also donating time and money to sexual health organizations is another great way to go. Now, given that the federal government is going to be less and less, it seems like they're going to be less and less funding and supporting comprehensive sex ed, this is unfortunately going to fall more on our community now. And we are going to have to do things ourselves. We are all we have, and we need to do everything that we can to apply our skills to help each other grow and be healthy and safe and improve the public health. So the more you're able to contribute, the better. And I know not all of us have time. Try contributing money. Not all of us have money. Try contributing time. If you don't have any of those, even just sharing this information on your social media to people you know, that's another thing you can do. Everybody can do something. And so do what you can. This is my huge list of sources. If you want the source info, you can always email me. That's fine. So I also have a few resources for you all to know about. First is SECUS and Advocates for Youth. This week is actually National Sex Ed Week of Action, which is why we chose this week to do this. SECUS organizes the National Sex Ed Week of Action. And Advocates for Youth is the group that made the National Sex Ed Standards. We also have Youology, which is one of my favorite youth sex ed books. It's for kids like, I would say 8 to 15 probably. And it talks about puberty and fertility and stuff as like in an age appropriate way that makes sense and is interesting. It uses little characters that have names and tells like stories from their like fictional perspectives. It's very gender neutral, which is great because it's inclusive of boys and girls and also non-binary folks, trans folks, people of all sexual orientations, which is wonderful. And it is written by 2 doctors. We also have Essential Sex Education Guide for Parents, which is one I really liked. One of the things I liked about it is it talked not only about providing accurate information, but also sharing your family's values with your kid in a way that encourages critical thinking. Instead of just saying, this is the way you have to do it, this is the way everyone should be doing it, saying, this is what we value in our family, and this is why. Other people may have different values. and just giving them as much information as possible so they can form their own set of values, hopefully based on what you agree with, but it's really good for them to think critically. I also really like this book called It's Not Hysteria by Dr. Karen Tang. That one is about reproductive health stuff for people assigned female at birth, that is people with uteruses. And it talks about all kinds of common disorders, but also encourages people to keep seeking second opinions when doctors ignore their symptoms, because unfortunately, women in particular, their symptoms are ignored or swept under the rug by doctors. And this is not all doctors. I mean, I personally have some good doctors, luckily, but it is a lot more common. And that's why it's important to learn a lot and be able to take that information to your doctor. I know your doctor will be like, don't trust Dr. Google, but I don't think it's a bad idea to at least have some background on things, especially from credible sources. That's probably why they say don't trust Dr. Google, because then you're going to go to like your random uncle's Facebook page or something. I hope you're not all doing that. Our Bodies, Ourselves is in its, I don't know, like 10th edition now or something. It is a very famous book written by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. It was written in the 70s, and it was one of the very first books that put health into the hands of women and gave them that information rather than just trust your doctor. Because as we know, not all doctors are doing a good job out here. A lot of them are, but it's really good to have that background so you can at least evaluate. Then we also have Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, which was written more recently, and it was written by and for trans people. And it is kind of the same general setup as Our Bodies, Ourselves, but pertains especially to trans health issues, including sexual health, but not just limited to that. So those are some books I really like. Let's see what else we got. This is my contact information. So you can email me with questions anytime. Follow me on Instagram. I do post fun sexual health content all the time. So that's fun. But I would like to answer questions if y'all have any. Oh, was I perfectly clear? Yes.
And I know we are trying to get to time, but I feel like, I don't know, this has just been in my head for a while. Now, as we're seeing so many attacks through policies, through censorship efforts, especially against trans, LGBTQ, how do you have any advice or guidance or insight in how to support LGBTQ plus students or youth that might be in our lives?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for asking that. First, going to plug the organization I work for in my day job, Q+. That is an organization that provides LGBTQ youth programming around Connecticut. Really great stuff. I do admin, but occasionally I fill in at groups, and the kids really, really have a good time and really feel supported. So there's that. But there are a lot of organizations around the state that do provide youth programming. So one thing you could do is support those groups. But if you have an LGBTQ kid in your life, first of all, just being supportive and being there for them is really important. The statistics from the Trevor Project show that LGBTQ kids who have at least one supportive adult in their life are 60% less likely to experience suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. So that's very significant, like literally just one adult. You could be the difference between suicidal ideation and not that. So that's really important. Listening is really important, and taking kids at their word. We have a lot of adults who will be like, well, they're too young to know this. First of all, kids have a general idea of their gender that's solid by age 3. This is from the American Academy of Pediatrics. I'm not just word vomiting this. In addition, the majority of LGB folks, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, have an idea that they may not be straight by their teens. Not everybody, but it is statistically significant. And a lot of people continue to feel that way for their whole lives. On the other hand, not like sexuality and gender are fluid, they can change throughout someone's life, but saying something like, oh, it's just a phase is going to invalidate what this kid is feeling. Even if it is just a phase, is it hurting anybody for them to explore their gender and sexuality? And is it hurting anybody if their gender and sexuality do change in any way? No. We would encourage kids to explore their other aspects of being, right? I mean, we see kids running around in, I don't know, what do the kids wear these days? They have like those broccoli haircuts, right? We're letting them do that. So like, yeah, it's exploring who you are is important as a youth. And that includes gender and sexuality in a safe way, as long as it's not harming themselves or others. Now, if you have a kid, especially if you yourself have a child that comes out as trans, ask them what they want. And if they so desire, bring them to a gender specialist. Gender specialists are there to help kids navigate being trans. They will prescribe what is needed. To be clear, children in Connecticut are not having genital mutilation surgeries or anything like that. They're not being provided like estrogen or testosterone as children. They are given supportive therapy and sometimes puberty blockers if appropriate, which have been being used since the 80s and are safe and reversible. So yeah, I mean, in short, it's basically a matter of being supportive and asking kids what they need to feel supported. That was long-winded, but does that answer the question?
Perfect.
Awesome. Do we have any questions in the chat?
No,
Okay.
none that have popped up.
Beautiful.
But thank you so much, Kim, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
There might be a couple of chats.
Oh,
this was
chats.
great. Thanks.
Aw.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. I certainly hope that you were as intrigued with the conversation as I was. Thank you so much, Kim. We have a lot of programs. We have tours coming up. We have another in this Stowe Prize series coming up on March 6th. That's going to look at, it's going to be a panel discussion with social workers who work in the education system. And I think it'll be very interesting. Keep an eye out for the tours that we do. We were talking earlier about our spirits tours.
Oh, it's so fun.
They
I
are
really
very
like it.
fun. A number of different tours as well. Our director of interpretation has been doing some really amazing stuff just to broaden the stories that we tell here, make them much more inclusive, understand Stowe within the context of much larger abolitionist movements and really elevating especially Black voices. So I hope that you guys can join us again. I hope everyone had a good time. And definitely, I hope we keep in contact with Kim and check out those resources.
Yay. I'm here if you have any questions.
Yeah.
So.
Feel free to still grab some snacks and a
Can you grab me wine? Yeah, as a reward. Yeah, gosh, I would love a picture. So I don't look like a cripple.